Honourable David Parker.
Mr Chairman, we heard Bill English say repeatedly that there was only one question that mattered, and the question that he kept putting to this House is what the Labor Party would do if we're re-elected. Not once did he address the issue as to whether this is the right thing to do, which is the question that this government should be asking. I'm going to put a number of other questions that the government should be answering on this that are very important that they haven't addressed. Will this increase the government deficit? Mr Chairman, I want to ask the Minister in the chair whether, on Treasury's advice, this plan of theirs to sell off half interests in these SOEs will increase the government's deficit. Will it, Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, will it? Mr Foss is in the chair. Can he answer that question? Will it? It's a very simple question. Is the advice of the Treasury that this will increase the government deficit, the operating balance before gains and losses, by about $100 million a year? I can tell the Minister, if he won't tell the House, that it will. I can also tell the Minister that that was hidden from the New Zealand public at the time of the election because his government and the Treasury under this government's watch did not account for the loss in profits. Whilst they said that they would bank the money from these SOE sales, they didn't calculate what the loss of profits would be that would increase the government's deficit. What's another question that I want answered by the Minister in the chair? Will over time this increase the current account deficit for this country? Will it increase the current account deficit? And again, Mr Chairman, if the Minister is willing to take a call on that, he will have to, if he's not going to mislead the House, admit that it will increase the current account deficit because the interest saved on the money that is not borrowed from overseas is less than the share of profits that will go to those overseas shareholders. And indeed, the Treasury says that up to 30% of the shares being sold, which is a total of 50% of the actual company, after only half of it is sold, 30% of the shares sold could end up in overseas ownership. I want to ask the government another question that the Minister of Finance didn't address. Why is it that the most important part of the government's economic plan for this 3 years is changing the ownership of what already exists? You know, if this is the central part of the government's economic agenda, what does that say about the inadequacy of their plan for our economy? And Mr Chairman, the reality is that this sort of ideological burp that we got just before the election was a consequence of the government being on the ropes and feeling the criticism that they had no adequate role for this, no adequate plan for the economy, because they're Conservatives, and all Conservatives generally do is trim back on expenditure a little bit, fiddle, and not really do anything progressive to change the shape of the economy. So in the face of that criticism, they came up with their so-called plan, which is to sell the SOEs, which does absolutely nothing to improve the output of the New Zealand economy, does not increase our exports, makes our current account deficit worse, as well as the government deficit. What's the other question that Mr English should have been asking instead of the single question that he was asking, which is what the opposition would do post the next election? He should have been asking or answering what is going to be the effect on power prices for residential consumers. Now, Mr Chairman, at the Select Committee we had not one generator and not one electricity retailer give evidence to the committee. We didn't hear from the Electricity Authority. We didn't hear from the Ministry of Economic Development as to what would be the effect on power prices. The only information that we got on what would be the effect on power prices was from some of the submitters opposed to this provision, and notably Molly Mellish, who's well known to many New Zealanders as having been a commentator on these issues that I heard the National Party slinging off about in interjection now. So what's that? You said she was very well known. Well, thank you for that. She is part of Grey Power, and her activism in these areas and her knowledge of the electricity markets goes back many years before her involvement in Grey Power. Mr Chairman, she gave evidence to the committee that even now SOE power prices are $265 per annum cheaper on average for a residential consumer who gets their power through an SOE or one of their subsidiaries compared with those who are buying from the private sector. Now, Mr Ryle stood a second ago and he said are we to be, Mr Chairman?
Honourable David Parker.
Are we to be, are New Zealanders so naive that they get power from people when it's more expensive from a private sector participant than a SOE? Well, the answer to that is sadly that is the reality, that New Zealand's electricity market is not perfectly competitive. Indeed, if it was a perfectly competitive market, we wouldn't have an electricity authority and we wouldn't have rules governing the conduct of the market to at least try and make it a little bit efficient. Those rules go, they're thicker than the Bible. This is a very complex and uncompetitive market, and it surely isn't purely competitive. Now, because we didn't have any evidence from a power company, power generator, we couldn't ask them whether that data was correct. Because we didn't have any evidence or advice from the Ministry of Economic Development to the Sector Committee, we couldn't ask them if that information was right. So the only way we could verify that information was through asking the Treasury officials. And when we did that, what did the National Party do? They closed down the Select Committee 5 weeks before we were due to report back so that we could not dig into that. So what did we do in response? We asked the Minister in the House today whether that information was correct or not. And if it wasn't correct, what is the average price charged by non-SOE deliverers of power to residential consumers compared with the SOE deliverers of power or retailers? And what did we get? We got blather from the Minister. We got the Minister being criticised by the Speaker for not having answered the second part in a primary question. Why is that question not being answered? Because they know that the truth is that SOE power prices to consumers, to residential consumers, are significantly lower, 12 or 13%, $265 per annum cheaper, and that margin will dissipate if we strengthen the profit maximisation model, if we remove the sense of community responsibility or the community responsibility obligations, and if we move to a price maximisation model. We're already seeing their cost structures increase. The increase in the salary for the Chief Executive of Mighty River Power this year was $400,000. That's not a salary of $400,000. That is an increase in the salary of $400,000 from $1.3 million per annum, already an incredibly high salary, to $1.7 million per annum. And the Minister of Finance has already acknowledged that that's because they're moving to a more commercial model. Their cost structures are going to go up and their prices will follow. Mr. Speaker, this government is out of touch. They're out of touch on not just this issue, they've been out of touch on other issues. They haven't got an adequate plan for the economy, and so they're left flailing around doing this sort of ideological thing. This is also going to increase asset inequality. Tony Ryle said, what's the problem with New Zealanders owning these companies? Well, they already do. What's wrong with New Zealanders already owning all of these assets through their government? There's no efficiencies to be gained here, or if there are, they're very, very minor. There are power price increases that will come as a consequence of this, and asset inequality is going to increase because the people who can afford to buy most of these shares are the wealthiest people in society, and the people who can't afford any are the poorest people. The wealthiest people in New Zealand, of course, are who this government plainly serves. 40% of their income tax cuts went to the top 10% of income earners in New Zealand. Those are the people who are going to be acquiring these shares, not mum and dad on average. Mum and dad on average don't have the money in their pocket to acquire these shares. Mr. Speaker, I think it's an outrage that we have not yet had any acknowledgement from the government of a matter of fact, which is that the SOEs charge less currently for residential power than their private sector comparators on average. I'm going to give you another example of this. Do you know, Mr. Chairman, Alexandra is a small town, sits on the banks of the Clutha River, right next to the contact dams on the Clutha River, an enormous amount of power produced in that area. Their power charges are higher for their power. This is not Lines charges, this is their power charges. They're higher than people pay in Auckland and Christchurch per unit of electricity. How can that be right? How can that be right? That shows that this market is not competitive. And indeed, in that area again, in Alexandra area, look, the 31 cents or 32 cents per unit per kilowatt hour charged by Contact Meridian Energy is about 28, sort of 10% less in that area. So even now, Mr.
Todd McLean.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. What I would say, Mr. Chair, to the last speaker is, and he raised the issue